Thank you very much. So can you see that? Yeah. This is 5th grade me. And the unfortunate thing about this photo is that my mother made me wear some horrible tablecloth to get my picture taken. Not only that, they seem to have a giant fan in the photo booth that made my hair go this way. But yeah, this is 5th grade me, and I really liked to do a lot of things when I was younger. One of those things was to play video games. But this is the video game that I had to play. And when you play one-on-one baseball, that can only be fun for so long until it becomes tiresome. And if you look at this graphics, these are from about the mid-1980s. This was my form of baseball game. Of course, video games have come a long way since then. And because video games were pretty terrible, really, I started to do other things. And a lot of what I did involved other sources of media. One of them was I liked to watch TV a lot in the 80s. Cartoons were fantastic, but there was this one show called Reading Rainbow. And Reading Rainbow was on the air for a long time. And it was a show about books and opening minds and just books in general. And the host of that show was LeVar Burton. And LeVar Burton had a special way of connecting with people from his studio or wherever he was on location to the viewer watching Reading Rainbow. He would be downtown New York City in a authentic Chinese restaurant, eating a meal, and he would be talking about it, and they would show him. And then he would talk about a book from the Chinese culture. And then he would have a student come on, a little kid come on and review that book. And I was mesmerized by this because I didn't want to go back and play that awful video game. That wasn't really cool to look at. So Reading Rainbow was a really special moment in my life and a special thing that I really looked forward to every weekend, to watch what new books they brought, what kids they brought in, where was LeVar Burton going to be, what was he going to be up to. And it really inspired me to start reading books. It sounds kind of quirky to think that maybe TV could inspire somebody to actually read, when today everybody is anti-TV. But this television show was different. It was different. The opening was some really psychedelic opening where a dragon turned into a boat and had this really catchy song. And I was just mesmerized by it. I couldn't believe it was way better than that video game. I mean, come on, one-on-one baseball? Who plays one-on-one baseball? There was also a program called Book It. And Book It involved reading books, obviously. But at my elementary school, the teachers got really behind this program. And the way it worked was you had this big, gaudy-looking button, purple button that you wore to school. And you tried to read as many books as you could. And your goal was to get 5 gold stars on that button. For every 100 pages you read, 150 pages you read, you got a gold star. And once you got 5 gold stars, you got a gift certificate to Pizza Hut. And I love to eat. I love to eat. So it was this weird combination of, man, I can read books and I can go to Pizza Hut for free. So I started to read all these books. I started to earn all of these gold stars. And I was getting pizza certificates more than I could actually use, more than I could even eat. But Book It, I was really proud of that button. I had those buttons all over my backpack, and I tried to earn as many gold stars as I could. I really loved to read high-quality literature. The Karate Kid, the original Karate Kid, was really popular when I was younger. And they actually came out in book form. And through Scholastic, through the reading program at school, I got these books and these little paperback books, and I started to read them. And then I read number 2. And then I read number 3. And then I started to read other things. And I'm comfortable enough to admit that I read Little House on the Prairie. And it was a really interesting series, though, because nothing ever happened. But I kept reading them. They were just sitting in the winter, cold, and looking for ways of heat, looking for food, and I kept reading them. And as you can see, there were a lot of those books. And it was interesting to me because I think the writing was so the writing was so eloquent that I just kept reading, and I loved nature to begin with. So I was kind of really enthralled with these Little House on the Prairie books. I think I inherited them from somebody, probably a girl. I also really loved Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I have to tell you that Johnny Depp has nothing on Roald Dahl in his original version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was an amazing book, filled with really vivid characters. And I just loved this book. I probably read it 50 times. And I was starting to, I didn't really love reading yet. I was starting to really like reading a lot because I wanted that pizza. So I was reading these books and I just kept reading, and then I stumbled upon this book, and it's called High Pockets. And I loved baseball. And I saw this book on the shelf, and the cover had a baseball player on it. And I grabbed it off the shelf, and I took it home, and I started reading it. I'm like, I'm going to read this book about baseball. And I started reading this book, but it wasn't really about baseball. It was about this baseball player who runs over a kid, and the kid gets hurt and in the hospital. But this baseball player was not a team player. All he cared about was himself. And he hit this kid with his car. And suddenly, he starts to go to the hospital and visit this kid. And this baseball player was a big star. But this kid who he hit had no idea who he was. This kid's like, I don't care. Who are you? I don't know who you are. So the kid he became really ill. He was very injured. And the main character in High Pockets, the baseball player, kept going to visit this kid in the hospital. And all of a sudden, this baseball player, who only cared about himself, started to change. And it was the first time I read a book where I saw a character change and start one way and then become something else by the end of the book. By the end of the story, he becomes this big team player. And he goes and visits this kid and forms a relationship with him. And he starts to change. And this little boy who he had hit with his car started to change this big baseball star and to change his attitude and his mentality. So this book is really the one that made me love reading. I loved the baseball in it, but I also loved the characters and the story, and I loved getting that pizza. My parents had a station wagon when I was growing up. Station wagons were really the hot item. This was like kicking car back then. And the thing with this station wagon was that in the very, very back end, it had two seats that folded up. And in those two seats, you had to face each other. So you're like facing each other, sitting down, riding in a station wagon, feeling like you're going to vomit everywhere. Because you're in the back of a station wagon and you're going like this. And I came from a pretty big family of 4 kids. And my brother and I sometimes would sit in the back of the station wagon. And we would drive to my grandmother's house, my grandparents' house. They lived in this tiny town in Missouri. And it was a town called Lilburn, Missouri. And this town was awesome because, first of all, there were only 1,200 people who lived there. Second of all, my grandfather was the sheriff. There were only 2 policemen. One was my grandfather, one was his brother. And they had this black telephone in their bedroom. A black telephone. And that telephone was the police phone. So if anybody called the police, this black telephone rang in my grandparents' bedroom and had this really dark, ominous ring to it. And my cousin and I, we'd hear it ring from across the house, and we'd walk in to the bedroom, we'd just stand there in the doorway, listening to that telephone ring, saying, what could it be? Who's calling the police? So of course, we were 10 years old, 5th grade. We'd run over and we'd answer it. Lilburn Police Department. And of course, they would say, so-and-so's miss, so-and-so's stole a bike, or something like that. You know, big town trouble. Stolen bike. My grandfather, being the sheriff and knowing everybody, the longtime sheriff, he knew who it was right away. So he would just show up to the person's house, knock on the door. Billy, did you steal the bike? Yeah. Then he would just, do what he had to do. It was a really small town. They had this huge carnival, though, on Main Street. And on Main Street, my cousin and I rode these two bikes, these two awesome bikes. They were actually my grandmother's bikes with baskets on them. So here we are, two boys riding around town, this little town on these bikes. We were just running the town. We would go to the gas station and pay the gas attendant and get our chocolate drinks and drink them. And it would be 105 degrees out and 100% humidity in the Midwest. We didn't care. We rode everywhere. We'd go to the general store. There really was a general store. And we would buy wiffle balls and baseball bats, and then we'd go play wiffle ball all day long. And we rode our bikes everywhere across that town, everywhere, except here. Because this town was segregated. And this is 1985. And I'm like, wait a second. This town is segregated? It's 1985? And we'd ride our bikes to this place. They were kind of like railroad tracks. And we would look across the railroad tracks because I wasn't allowed to go to the other side. And we would look across those railroad tracks and we'd see kids riding their bikes, riding their grandmother's bikes. But they had different colored skin than we did. But I wasn't allowed to associate with them because of the way this town was. It wasn't my grandfather's fault. It was no one's fault. It's just the way things were. Nobody knew any different, really. No one knew any different. So we hop in the station wagon. And we go back home. And I turn on the TV. And LeVar Burton is there. And I think to myself, wait. LeVar Burton, he's taking me to all these places. He's introducing me to all these books. But he looks like those kids. Those kids I'm not allowed to associate with. How can he be on TV and I can't even talk to these kids? And all I wanted to do when I rode my bike up to those railroad tracks is come up and stop and just talk to one of those kids and say, hey man, do you watch Reading Rainbow? Do you get free pizzas? Have you ever read the book High Pockets? So I became obsessed with this idea of a divided town and a divided place. And it weighed on me for a long time. And I started writing when I was in high school. And I started writing poems about NBA players. It'd be like you guys writing a poem about Kobe Bryant. Not good stuff. These poems were really bad. But I didn't even know what I was doing. I was way into sports, and I was just kind of writing these silly poems about all of these European players who came to play in the NBA. Vlade Divac, Drazen Petrovic, all these guys who played in the NBA during that time. And then I had this teacher. There's always a teacher, right? There's always one teacher who gets you. And I had this teacher, and his name was Mr. Dickon. And he let me read my silly poems about NBA players in class, out loud. And he didn't care. He just wanted me to get up in front of the class and start reading. And he knew I was writing. But he took an interest. And we could be reading Hamlet or that other Scottish play that I'm not allowed to say the title of it in a theater. It's bad luck. We could be reading some kind of Shakespeare, and it didn't matter. He would let me come up and read my poems to the class before class even started. So I became obsessed and enthralled and engrossed in this topic of this divided place because I had experienced that. And I had this idea about a story to write about this town that's divided by a line, an actual line. And I struggled really to tell this story for a long time. And I started writing it in 2001. I was just out of college. Baseball was over. I was getting a job, not making much money, doing anything. But was really, really mesmerized by this divided place. And I wanted to tell my story. I wanted to tell people about what I experienced. So I kept writing. And in 2008, the story looked something like this. I tried to write this story with a big omniscient narrator who knows everything. This is an example of that. I tried to write this story in third person. The main character's name is Derby. And it wasn't working. Something wasn't working. Then I tried first person, and I was getting closer. I felt like I was getting closer to telling this story in the right way. And then I realized I need some help. I need somebody's help. I need to give this story to other people. They need to read it and tell me how it can be better. So I gave my notes. I gave my story to other people, and they gave me notes on it. And I kept working and toiling away on this story. And I got this special set of notes from a person in the publishing industry. And she urged me to go in this other direction. And I did. And I rewrote the whole story from page 1. And the story became alive. Because that line down the middle of the town became alive. And I made it a character in the book. And all of a sudden, these characters who were living on both sides of this divided town had a reason to exist. They had a reason because they wanted to break down that line and break down that barrier. So I kept writing this story, and it got closer and closer. And then, at the beginning of this year, I got it right. At least I felt I got it right. Stories are never done. Creative work is never done, really, until you say it's done. And then you put it away, and you have to move on. So I was writing other stuff along the way, but I felt like I finally got this story right, and this is the opening line to the story. And it has a lot more to do with just a divided town. It has to do with a kid and a girl, a boy and a girl, and love, and the power of love and how that can break down different barriers, and hope. So all of these things in my life, I call my dots. The theme of this conference is connecting the dots to your future. And these were my dots. There was Reading Rainbow in LeVar Burton. There was Book It, a special reading program. Not just that it was a button and a reading program and free pizza, but there were teachers who actually got behind this program and pushed it and pushed it. And with their support, I was able to find books that really meant something to me. There was that special book about that character that changed over time. And then there was that experience with those railroad tracks in that town. And then there was that teacher, because like I said, there's always a teacher. A teacher who got me, who understood me, and who supported me. And then there were notes from other people. There was feedback from other people. And all of these people allowed this kid who was in 5th grade with the horrible shirt and that bad hair to write this story. And I felt like I finally got it right, but I didn't do it alone. I had all these people who were dots in my life, who connected my dots and led me to this. And the question for you is not who are the people who are your dots. It's nice to have those people in your life. But how can you become a dot in someone else's life? What are you going to accomplish? What are you going to do that affects somebody else? How are you going to be like that teacher? How are you going to be like those teachers who supported that reading program? What are you going to do? How are you going to become a dot? Thank you.